Today we're talking with Terry Owens, Director of Security with Shamrock Trading Corporation. Terry is a former Kansas City, Missouri police officer. We'll learn a little bit about his background in law enforcement as well as how he prepared himself and ultimately transitioned into the private sector and corporate security. Hope you enjoy it.
Quality trained security officers and virtual officers.
Welcome to the Titan Protection Podcast. Today we are here with Terry Owens, Director of Security for Shamrock Trading Corporation. Terry, appreciate you coming on.
Hey, I'm happy to be here. I'm honored, and thanks for having me on.
You got it. Just to kick us off here, why don't you tell us a little bit about your current role, who Shamrock is, kind of what your day-to-day responsibilities are, and what it's like being the Director of Security for Shamrock Trading Corporation.
Well, I'll just start off and tell you it's awesome, by the way. So Shamrock's a trucking logistics company, and they do everything from brokerage to factoring to fuel and financing, and it's such a resilient business. Trucking is such a resilient business, and everything that we do in the supply chain revolves around trucking, and you don't realize it. And I didn't realize it till I was approached about this position, how important the trucking industry is. So I was really honored and really fascinated that Shamrock was willing to hire me, and on a day-to-day basis, a lot of it has to do with understanding the difference between contract and proprietary security services. Like for me, I'm part of the proprietary security services, but we work with Titan very closely on the contract side, and understanding the laws with regard to co-employment, understanding the laws with regard to risk and liability issues. And so understanding those access control and cameras and how they integrate with each other, working on satellite locations, how does all that look, coming up with emergency procedures. And really it's a lot of everything that you can think about security related, but it's a great company, and it's they're all about learning. So they gave me opportunities to really listen to what's going on from the business side of things, because it's really been able to help me protect their organization better.
Nice. Yeah. And, just kind of seeing their growth, is also part of, that picture is they're growing so quickly that you talk about satellite offices, and it's not only the campus here, but all of the different things that are growing for them. But, your position is kind of like that quarterback position that's coordinating all of the different pieces and, talking with the IT team and coordinating with the guard staff and the C-suite and kind of pulling all those pieces together is kind of what I see from my end. I don't know if you'd agree with that or not. It's kind of the job role, but it's hard to sum up in just a couple sentences.
Well, you have all those different aspects. You have the HR team, so you're always going to have liability and legal issues that are going on, and the security team, the legal team. So, coming from law enforcement, to get a call from the legal department, you're just like, oh my gosh, this just sucks. But in reality, for here, I'm legal and HR. They're my best friends. They're the ones that I have to reach out to. I have to have that good relationship with. And you kind of talked about it being a quarterback position. We have the Chiefs here, by the way. Go Chiefs. And when you think about it from that perspective, you have all these different entities, and they need somebody to make audible calls, when things are developing. But having the understanding that you have those coaches that are behind it, even professional athletes have coaches, and hey, the executives at Shamrock, they're really open to listening. They're really great about, taking input, but at the same time, I have to have the realization that, it's their job to look over the overall business from a whole, and I have a small piece of that, but taking that coaching is really important.
It's a good point because, yes, from a security perspective, we can often prescribe certain things or have certain, feelings about something that's security related, but oftentimes decision makers have to weigh that with a bunch of other factors or the whole picture of the business. What are the downstream effects and how does that go? And so that's an important piece of a role like that is how do you coordinate those things and give them the information they need and, be on board with the overall decision, because sometimes that may not be just security related or through the lens that we look at it. But that's a good point.
Yeah, it's what's the risk tolerance that the organization is to going to take
Right.
on, and and it's my job to give them the best information possible. But at the same time, I have to have the understanding that and not be mad about decisions that are being made. That having that understanding, it's not a personal attack. They're looking at it from a bigger perspective. And they're looking at it from they have to generate money in order to make the business work. And we could spend umpteen $1 million hardening every single asset there is, but in reality it's not realistic, and it's from a risk perspective. What is our tolerance?
Right. Well, no, it's an interesting point, and especially when you transition from law enforcement into a position in the private sector. I know, from my experience, when you're at the police department, your whole world is risk-based, and it's all about officer safety and from a security perspective. And when you step into the private sector, that's certainly your main job role, but it's one piece of the bigger picture, and you've got revenues and businesses and, like you said, legal and HR and different things to consider in that. It's not only the security and safety on the private sector side. And speaking of that in law enforcement, so your job previous to this, you were with the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. Can you tell us a little bit about your law enforcement career, how it started, how it progressed, and kind of ultimately what got you looking into the private sector?
Yeah, so I spent the last 15 years for working with the Kansas City Police Department. Policing, it is what you make out of it, and a lot of it is the relationships that you have built over the years. Having former law enforcement, having that understanding that there's so many different things out there. I learned so much just from listening to people that are in other sectors of business. We would be out with people that had done really cool jobs. They're like, "Oh, tell me some cool cop stories." And I was like, "Well, no, I want to hear all about whatever you do."
Right.
You'd be out with some military people, and they'd be like, "Oh, tell me about this," and you're like, "Hey, you were involved in this massive operation."
Right.
So you get to do all those things, but. I mean, I got started back in 2007 just as a patrol officer, and I shouldn't say just as a patrol officer. It's honestly going back, it's probably one of the most fun times I ever had.
Right.
It's different when you're supervising the circus and it's your circus to supervise
right.
than what it is you're part of the circus.
Right.
So
Yep.
going back there, I got started working overnights, and I had an opportunity after a couple of years to go to a surveillance task force for a little bit, and you think you're really good at doing things. You're like, man, this is awesome. And then you realize how bad you are at surveillance, especially when, other people are like, hey, you might think about doing this a little differently. You're like, oh, I didn't even really think about it that way. Or, it's almost to the point where like a suspect knocks on your window and be like, hey,
Right.
I'm not going to do anything while you're watching me.
Yeah, let you know they're watching.
Yeah.
And surveillance, when you were part of that unit, was that who were you surveilling, or what was your typical assignment?
So one of the issues that Kansas City has a lot of, just like most major metropolitan police departments, is property crime. So, it was following around burglars, stolen auto suspects, all those things. And, I mean, some of those people are really hard to watch because you hear the term drive it like you stole it, I mean, they literally drive it like they stole it.
So it's tough to tail somebody like that and stay inconspicuous.
Yeah, so you learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about, how to do things. And, I didn't suck at it forever. I got better. I learned.
Yeah.
But initially you think you walk in the door and it's just kind of having that humbling going, oh, I'm not as good as I thought I was at this, even though I'd never done it before.
Right.
So I kind of moved on. I moved back into patrol as a field training officer. And man, if you want to talk about learning how to talk to people that have totally different backgrounds.
Right.
I mean, a lot of times people are older than you. They have more experience than you, especially have a lot more life experience than you.
Right.
Here I might be, 28, 29 years old. I have 6-7 years on the police department. There's somebody that was 40 that owned a business, and
no kidding. Well, and you're in a car with them for 8 hours a day.
Yep.
You get to know people real quick. I mean, my FTOs, you get to learn a lot about them, and that's a pretty intimate experience to ride around in a car for an extended period of time. But yeah.
Yeah, and like my a lot of my recruits I still talk to today.
Yeah.
They call me. They're like, "What the hell are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, well."
Moving on.
Moving on. But like it was a great experience. But so I went to investigations as a detective, and I started out in domestic violence. And domestic violence was a really good experience because the volume, like you really learn how to push case files through and do that. But where I really got a lot of experience was as a detective. So everyone thinks of homicide as, homicide, robbery, all those things. Well, homicide covers a couple different things. And so I was part of the homicide unit, but I was part of the assault squad.
Okay.
And I really learned how to be a better detective working in the assault squad. So you work pretty much every, violent crime there is, shootings, assaults with, like physical assaults where there's severe injuries, but also I was part of the police shooting team. And so learning how to speak with people who the police have shot, it's family. It was,
wow.
You have to think it from that perspective where, hey, even though so-and-so may have done something that warranted the police shooting him, that's somebody's brother, that's somebody's son, that's somebody's family member. And you really have to learn how to talk to people. And so as a detective in the assault squad, I really learned how to be better at speaking to people. I learned how to be better at communicating with people. And that kind of led me to my next assignment as a sergeant. I took the sergeant's test. I was lucky enough to make it on the first time, and there's a lot of people who take it over and over again. I just had some really good coaches, and we'll talk about that later, how important that is. But I was signed to East Patrol, got the opportunity to start the East Patrol Impact Squad, and the Impact Squad was really great because, you have cops riding with you, you have TV shows riding with you constantly, so you're doing surveillance on murder suspects, and it was a collaboration between uniformed elements and surveillance elements, and then you're working with task force officers from federal agencies, being part of Operation Legend, working with all the working with all those other agencies. And in 2020, we all know about the events with George Floyd and all that stuff. Well, I had to transfer in prior to those events happening to go to North Patrol, and I just kind of started that process, and that was before the whole George Floyd thing blew up. Where am I going to go? And I was at the 13-year mark going.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because I wondered how much of the current defund the police landscape affected or influenced your decision, because you mentioned you transitioned out of East Patrol into North Patrol and then started thinking about private sector stuff. Did any of that have an impact on your decision either to make the jump into the private sector or start exploring those types of things outside? Was that a factor?
You know what? Sometimes it, you can say that it's not a factor, and that would be a lie. There is something to it, but it's not. It was certainly not the entire thing.
Right.
There's a lot of other external factors, and policing is what you make of it.
Right.
Where you want to go with things, how you want to do things, how well you're willing, or how much effort you're willing to put into the assignment.
Right.
And there are certainly external factors, but you have to think about family factors too. I was working, all hours of the day and night, all hours, getting called out in the middle of the night to go find whoever or deal with whatever situation. Part of our responsibilities were any type of protest. So not only, like the George Floyd stuff, but, there were protests. There were rallies and protests for everything under the sun. So when you start looking at those bigger perspectives, it does have an influence.
Right.
But it certainly, it was a minuscule comparatively to all the other external factors.
Collectively. And kind of speaking to that same topic and talking about, you mentioned you were on the police shooting squad, so you guys would investigate officer-involved shootings. And that, I know, in Kansas City has come under scrutiny because they are saying the people that are involved, the agency that's involved in the shooting, should not also be doing the investigation. I know there's some talk about having the county handle some of those. I don't know how much of that changed. But I guess what I'm curious about is kind of your experience, because you mentioned in that role was challenging because you would often have to interview, communicate with the family members who ultimately you were representing, but they also view you as part of the problem or the person that also you were part of the organization that took their life. I'm just curious, that was interesting when you brought that up. What was that experience like, and did you ever have any that you felt uncomfortable with, or you felt like you were investigating where the police had wrongdoing, or typically the ones you were involved with, were they clean incidents or,
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of it is how you speak to people, and that's one of those things that I really learned is how to communicate with people. So the incidents that I were involved in were pretty cut and dry. I mean, I would say I was probably involved in about a dozen while I was there. And at the same time, so, I worked for a large metropolitan police department, and there were often times where, there would be a shooting, and I had no idea who the shooting officer was.
Right.
I maybe had seen their name in a report or something like that. So, but we also had an incident where, when I was there, one of my peer detectives, his brother was involved, and so he just recused himself.
Right.
He recused himself out of it. I didn't know his brother or anything like that, but
right.
You have incidents like that where you're like, hey, this is a bad idea for me to be involved in.
Right.
Those types of incidents. But for the most part, the response from people was pretty good because of the way we talk to people.
Right.
You have to use empathy, and you have to really use those soft skills to be able to talk to people. And if you don't have it then, when you start to transition out of law enforcement, it's going to be really tough. So learning those skills early, and it doesn't matter whether you're a first level security officer, frontline supervisor, wherever, those soft skills are really important.
Right.
Because you could be, if you're a frontline security officer, you could be dealing with the CEO of a company.
That's right.
And having those conversations with people, you never know who's going to come back and be there helpful for you.
Well, yeah, I know when I was in the academy, or when I was being trained, we were kind of brought up on the ask, tell, make scenario, where it's you ask somebody to do something, you tell them to do something, and then you make them do it. And that was kind of adopted and used. But you look at that, if you remember the Southwest Airlines incident where that doctor was pulled off the plane, those officers came on the plane, they asked him to leave, they told him to leave, and then they made him leave. Well, that didn't end up very well, and I think that was kind of the shift of, the goalposts almost. Those officers were doing what they were trained to do at the time, but now that landscape has shifted, where it's no longer, what we're going to do now is we're going to come on the plane. If you refuse to leave, we're just going to tell everybody to get off, and hey, folks, this plane's not going anywhere, and just kind of wait it out and do it different. I don't think that's a bad idea. I just think that everybody needs to play on the same playbook. I think there needs to be a lot of training. And when you were in the academy, how much did they do de-escalation wise, or how much in your academy training or any of your law enforcement training was focused on communication, de-escalation, emotional intelligence? Would you say there's a lack of that training, or was there a pretty good?
It's definitely there, but some of it is also engaging. So, in law enforcement, you get these issues where you're having this training, but there's so many of you, it's hard to engage.
Right.
But in the private sector, hey, so like for me, I'm looking at the civil liability of things.
Right.
If I have contract security that is working, on our property, what is our risk tolerance?
Right.
Where are we going to go? And we spend a lot of time talking about, hey, what are the alternative methods of handling it? And actually, one of my academy instructors, Mike Youth, he now owns a business where he does professional de-escalation training, and he does a lot of expert witness stuff, and Mike is fantastic. He trained over, if I had to guess, I would say probably 1,000 officers over his years at the academy. And somebody who has a generational influence, well, he does, he has one of those innate abilities where he can relate to people and talk to them. And if he has to use force, he can use force, but he's more wanting you to comply with what he's telling you to do by relating to you. Right. And I think that's a lot of their business now is, getting people to understand law enforcement and private security, that mind shift. That mind shift is huge.
Right. Yeah. And we're right in the middle of that. And I think that's what, and I do think that's what, I think there is positive steps forward and work to be done there for sure. And you mentioned earlier, you said there were some good ideas that came out of some of the feedback and some of the different stuff out of the George Floyd. Did you see much change after that, or are there items that you think need changed or addressed?
Well, I think some of it was the messaging too. It's kind of like, hey, if somebody's really amped up and you tell them to calm down, I mean, and that's kind of the reaction. But now that, hey, everything has started to settle down, that I think now in the next couple of years is where you will start to see that incremental change. Right. Because that change isn't going to happen overnight, and you're going to have that culture shift. You're going to have the people on the top, available to do the buy-in, and it's no different in the private sector. Hey, if I have this idea and the upper echelon of my organization doesn't want to do it, well, it's not going to get done. Right. And some of that is that communication and being able to convince people that, hey, this is the best way to do things, and society is telling us that, hey, we're going to do it. Right. Like in law enforcement, but it's going to take that time to shift over.
How was, because if you were, and especially a sergeant in the impact squad, I mean, how was the community in East Patrol? That's a pretty high crime area. How was the interactions after the George Floyd incident? Did you find it more divisive, more challenging to do the job? What was that like?
And to be quite honest, the people that were in those neighborhoods, yes, they live in high crime areas, but a lot of them are very hardworking people. Right. And, even today, I still have relationships with some of them where they still communicate on a regular basis about things that are going on. Right. And I think it really depended on the relationship that you had with the people in that community. And it, you can listen to the media and they can tell you that, hey, the police have all these problems and all that, which the policing does have problems. Right. And it's going to take time to correct. Right. But at the same time, that individual impact that a person can make is very important. Right. And it's no different. It's the same thing when you move over to that private sector. If you can't do it in the public sector, if you can't communicate with people in the public sector, you certainly aren't going to be able to communicate with people in the private sector. Right. And I'm sure you see that. Oh yeah. A good friend of mine, he has to hire prior law enforcement for one of his positions. That's kind of like one of their caveats. And he said, I'm not looking for the person that couldn't get along with people in the police department. Right. I'm looking for somebody that has that soft skill, the ability to talk to people. Right.
And that's everything. And I think that's and that can be sometimes, you were talking earlier about there's no competition. You can't get upset at the police department and go, we're going to use your competitor. And sometimes how that communication can come, you can start to communicate that way because there's no other alternative or what. And so I think it's a lesson learned when you make that leap into the public sector is you better have those skills, because if you don't have that to rely on anymore, of just that you have no other choice, because there's plenty of choices in the private sector. Before we jump away from your law enforcement career, I was just curious, I forgot to ask you at the beginning, so what was your initial assignment patrol-wise? When you were first out on the street, where were you? So
I was Metro Dog Watch. So Dog Watch is what they refer to as overnights, and people are like, oh man, I could never work overnight, those hours. And when it's not your circus to supervise, man, it was a lot of fun. You have there's a lot of people that are in your age group, and there's a lot of stuff going on. You constantly have things going on. So really it was a great time. Even we kind of have chatted personally about, starting off in loss prevention, where
Right.
before you're supervising everybody, it's
It's
great
fun chasing shoplifters until you're supervising the people chasing
Yeah, and
shoplifters.
then the attorneys are calling you and
Right.
not them.
Right. Exactly. And Metro Patrol and Dog Watch specifically, I mean, the idea, that's you get out of the academy and let's get you into very busy sectors at the busiest times, which is midnights in the center of the city kind of idea, right? Get you exposed to as much as, as many reps and as high frequency of some of those types of calls. Is that the idea behind it?
Oh yeah, and and a lot of it is, where are the tenured officers at? Our training officers now, how are they going to be able to teach people? Well, you teach people by going on those shooting calls, by going on those cutting calls, by going to those injury accidents, and then you get there and, hey, somebody shot, and
Right.
everything's just going absolutely wild, and you're like, as a recruit, you're just on sensory overload, and your FTO is kind of like, okay, step by step,
Right.
let's work this out.
It's an elephant, small bites. Yeah. When you were working the streets and in your law enforcement career, did you have much interaction with private security, good or bad? Just curious what your common experience was, or...
Well, and some of it is, so the security companies that we encountered, and we've had this discussion. I think that's part of the reason why Titan exists is because they were untrained. And I remember a security company getting into a car chase down 435, and I'm like, what are you doing?
Yes.
But also at the same time, I remember how I was treated by officers when I was in loss prevention.
Right.
I remember the officers who treated me really great.
Right.
And were very, very encouraging, saying, hey, give us a call, all that. And then the officers who were like, all right, come on, let's get this over with. And, those things, how you treat people matters. And so I took those experiences, and I tried to make sure that I turned that into how I treated people in law enforcement as well, especially in private security, because I knew how it was to be on the other side of that chair. And then, you get somebody saying, hey, so, what can I do to get on the police department, or, what steps do I take? Well, a lot of people were just like, yeah, whatever, go apply. You would get that sarcastic, apply like everybody else. And it's just kind of a jerk thing to say to people.
Right. Somebody that's interested into, right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so those impressions are, I mean, they're long lasting. They will always remember that. And I think it's like, I did some contract work for Marriott, and I think they were talking about like people are 4 times more likely to speak negatively about a customer experience than about a positive.
Right. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
So
I think that's true.
Bringing that to how I treat people, especially even, the current contract security people that work on our property, I have no reason to, be after them all the time. I can really engage with them, and if they feel like people don't, people don't know how much you care until, or how much you know until how much you care,
Right.
until they find out how much you care.
Right.
Well, that really does apply. That really does make a difference, and how you interact with people.
Yeah, you can't mail that in for sure. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, so you've done the law enforcement thing, you're working the streets, kind of, you're starting to make that decision of maybe I want to step into the private sector or public sector. What did that look like? How did you, and kind of what was the timeline of that? How did you prepare yourself? What types of things were you looking at, and how did you ultimately make that leap?
So I think probably, I would say from start to finish, maybe 15 or 16 months.
Okay.
And, you get these people that, hey, I'm getting ready to retire next month. I should start looking for a job. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, hey, that's really foolish.
Well, and especially, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to interview you on this, was there is a lot of law enforcement folks that can use their experience, but it can't be the only thing. If the only thing on your resume is former law enforcement officer, and that's what you're hanging it on.
They're a dime a dozen.
They are. And
dozen.
It's valuable experience, and I'm not trying to knock that, but kind of putting together the total package is important to be attractive in the private because, again, there's lots of choices. You get into a scenario where so how did you prepare yourself beyond just your law enforcement experience?
And actually, just prior to coming here, I met somebody for lunch, and we really sat down and kind of talked about those things, how to prepare yourself and the mistakes I made. And really one of the biggest mistakes I made was I wasn't involved with ASIS early enough. And ASIS is the American Society for Industrial Security. So like currently in Kansas City, the current chairperson is Jared Oakton. And so I met up with him and said, hey, can I meet up with you for coffee? And he's a security consultant, and he did a great job of explaining what he does. And I met up with somebody that's in the IT industry that, I think he does internal threat. And so he was explaining to me what he did. And, some of it was I didn't know what I wanted to do and, exploring those options. And that's where ASIS really got involved. And, one of my friends who also has the CPP, which is a Certified Protection Professional, and we'll talk about that later, recommended the book So You Want to Get Into Corporate Security by Carlos Francisco. And I said, oh, okay, I just kind of blew it off. Well, I read the book, or actually, sorry, I didn't read the book. I listened to the book, and I was like, oh my gosh, we in going back to earlier, one of the first chapters is be everybody's best friend.
Right.
Be everybody's best friend. And you start looking at those things, and when you're looking at the future, hey, where do you want to go? And Carlos suggests, hey, 14 months to 2 years to 3 years out, start thinking these things out. But
wholeheartedly agree. Yeah.
It must have been fate. You hear that, Carlos? It must have been fate. He just happened to call North Patrol. I just happened to answer.
No kidding.
Yeah, and so they were coming to Kansas City for an event for their company, and I got to sit down and talk to them, and some of the things that they really did was they championed the coaching for me. I didn't realize how hard it was to do it by myself until I had coaches behind me. They could kind of say, hey, well, you need to start thinking about this. You need to start thinking about this. So Stan Parlow is on Carlos's podcast. It's the Corporate Security Translator. He talks about LAPD, the Life After Police Department, and starting that transition and what you can do to help yourself. But man, there's so many people out there that I would tell them, hey, whether you are a frontline security officer or you are a supervisor or a manager or in policing or whatever, if you are in that field, join ASIS. I mean, really, the opportunities and the networking that are out there, you don't realize how many people are like that out there. And then, a lot of people encourage me to take the CPP exam, which is the Certified Protection Professional exam, and it's for executive level management. And I didn't realize that myself and my friend who worked for the police department, we were the only ones in the entire state of Missouri and Kansas that were active duty law enforcement that had that.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow. That's crazy. Well, it's a great point because I would have similar. I mean, the networking and the mentorship is everything because, and especially ASIS, you get into those groups and you network, and especially when they see somebody that's willing to do the work necessary, then you also kind of amplify those feelers out there of if there's job opportunities, those kind of come your way. So the networking and the mentorship, but then also the education piece, the CPP, like you talked about. For your role, your law enforcement career doesn't give you how to make an access control system, talk to a camera system. How do we design a building that we're building to be conscious of CPTED and crime prevention through environmental design and all these different things? That's the piece, and that's when I first originally met you, that was kind of what had impressed me most, was this was somebody that was doing the work to prepare themselves. They weren't just coming going, I worked at KCMO, I was a cop, now I want to go into the private sector and see what happened. And I think that piece of it is so important, to be able to get the education in the areas that you're weak and put together the total package for the job that you're going after.
And going back to that coaching, so Mike Benton, he's not on LinkedIn or anything, but he's a director of security, and he was a great champion for me to really help me understand more, because it's one thing reading it in a book,
right,
but then putting it in practical application. He really was that champion behind me to say, kept encourage me, hey, start learning about this. You might start thinking about this. Hey, this is where you're going to go.
Right.
This is like the direction things are going right now. But having that coaching behind you is so, my gosh, Ryan, I can't tell you how important it was. And, that networking, using LinkedIn. If you're not on LinkedIn, get on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn is very powerful for sure.
Yeah. And so what I did was, hey, if somebody viewed my profile or liked a picture and they had some type of law enforcement in their background, I'd connect with them and send them a connection request, and then send them a message saying, hey, would you be willing to do a video chat with me, just to kind of start that direction. And so many people are out there willing to help. Right. They really are. They're willing to help.
Right.
And man, if you don't take advantage of those opportunities in law enforcement, one thing that we were really good at is isolating ourselves.
Right.
You really kind of isolate yourself. You're out on an island. You're like, what do they know?
Right.
What do they know? When in reality, they know a lot more than you do.
Right.
And especially about the security industry, a majority of the people who are true professionals in security don't have any military or law enforcement background. Jared Oakton, the ASIS chairman right now, that's a perfect example.
Right.
There's a lot of people out there,
well,
but there's a lot of people that have both.
It's a great point that it's not only, and I think the bigger point is, be the total package. Don't just be one piece of it, whether it be, because just if you don't have the law enforcement
haven't you seen my resume?
Or exactly.
Yeah.
Right. It's just going my resume. I was a cop, and how do you put that stuff out there? So no, I agree completely. And that CPP, that is a important piece, and it's also kind of the designator that says, some work was putting into becoming that package. That's not an easy thing to get. I mean, that's a lot of coursework. That's a pretty, I haven't taken it or done it. It's a pretty expensive test.
I don't know how I passed it. But also, like, I'm just joking. It is a lot of work, but there's a lot of people who are on the have a PSP, which is a physical security professional, and that is equally under its own rights just as hard, but it's very technical. Like a lot of what you do, you're dealing with megapixels, and
right.
We're talking about massive camera systems. Your company does video verification and monitoring all over the country.
That's right.
You have to know those technical things.
Right.
I mean, and those skill sets that's beyond some of my knowledge. But you have people that are true security professionals,
right,
that work for your organization and do nationwide work.
Yeah. No, and you don't get that. Nobody at the police department ever trained me on megapixels and cameras and networking and that type of thing. So that education piece is important. So when you got through that piece, I mean, along the journey, it sounds like you were networking, kind of studying, preparing, and doing different things. How did you ultimately, when you got to the point you felt like you were getting closer, how did you market yourself, or how did you go out and identify opportunities that you wanted to apply for?
And some of it is, I had a couple of qualifications. Hey, is this something I can see myself in long term? What does the company do? Is it something I believe in? And what's the benefit and the downfall is going to be for my family?
Right.
Those are really important pieces of it. And and I'm so blessed to be able to work for a fantastic organization like Shamrock. They really, if I was going to say, hey, top notch organizations, they are top-notch organizations, but at the same time, being able to go out there and humble yourself, I think that is a huge part of it. Is
right.
I walk into your office all the time and talk to your people, and Ryan, I kind of feel like an idiot, listen to talking to some of your people that, like I said before, are true security professionals,
right?
Because they have so much technical knowledge. You have to be able to humble yourself and understand that. Listening to what other people have to say, because ultimately, like a lot of these things, hey, I have the big voice that's going to promote it up the chain.
Right.
Say, hey, I think we should do this. But listening to people that can give me true expertise, knowledge, and being able to trust what they say is so important.
Right. No, I agree. Yeah, absolutely. Well, any other thoughts, advice, anything to give out?
Yeah. So, we talked about having coaches in your corner. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. It's just Terry Owens, CPP.
I'll throw some links up there. I'd like to throw, I'll throw your LinkedIn up, mine. If there's anything we can do to help, I think you nailed it there with conversations and just advice, being open to that type of thing and paying it forward. But I'll throw your link up there. I'd also like to get a link up for Carlos's book. I think that's a valuable one. So you want to get into corporate security, and Carlos, he's been fantastic. He's been really great to work with. Stan Parlow, look him up on LinkedIn. He was a commander in Columbus, Ohio, and he was a VP for a major company, over their security. He's another one to reach out to. Nice. There's a lot of people out there that are willing to help people, even if you don't have any law enforcement experience. Reach out to me. I'll help guide you in the right direction of where you can go. Get you involved with ASIS. Get you involved with the right people, because that's really where it went. But having those coaches in your corner, I can't tell you how valuable it was. Awesome. I agree. We'll put some of those resources up in the description of the video, and if we can help out at all, please reach out. I'll throw up our LinkedIn as well. But appreciate you coming out and chatting. Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you so much. You got it. We'll see you later. See ya.